Right, good evening. It is 6:30. I'm Jonathan Pearl, and this is Democracy and General Purposes. Now, I've done my laptop in today, so I'm going to have to read off the script, so I'm going to do it quite sort of badly because of due to my eyesight. But the meeting will be broadcast live and recorded for playback on the Council's YouTube channel. Will anyone else be recording the proceedings? I ask so that people at the meeting will know this if this will be happening. Any members present, though, through the Skype call are reminded that the instant messaging will be visible on the webcast and should only be used to indicate their wish to speak. If the fire alarm sounds during the meeting, please remain seated, and members of the Democratic Services team will assess the situation and give further instructions on the evacuation of the building if necessary. So, now then, item 1, apologies. Can we have some order, please? We've had apologies from Councillor Webb, and I've also had a message from Councillor Hastie that she will be attending, but she's running 5 minutes late. Right, item 2, notification of substitute members, and I see Councillor Mrs. Joy.
Yes, Mrs. Joy for Councillor Webb.
Thank you. Item 3, there are no urgent items. Item 4, notification of visiting members, and in the far distance I see Councillor Hinder coming to the...
Thank you, Chair. Yes, with an interest in agenda item 16, and I've reserved my right to speak. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, and...
Councillor Brindle, I'm just here to observe, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Brindle. Item 5, are there any disclosures by members or officers? And I see none. Item 6, can I ask whether there are any disclosures of lobbying? Mrs. Rose, Councillor Mrs. Rose.
I don't know if you call it lobbying, but Councillor Harper has asked me to mention a couple of points when we get to item 16, please.
Okay. And are there any others? Councillor English.
I have been lobbied, curiously enough, on item 18.
Okay, thank you. And is that everybody? Excellent. Okay, so item 7, and I move that the items on the agenda be taken in public as proposed. Is that agreed? Excellent. Item 8, the minutes of the previous meetings. Can I just ask whether members have got any comments there on these? These appear to be on pages 1 through to 4. Go. Oh, Councillor Mrs. Rose.
I'd just like to mention item 17. I'd just like to say thank you very much to Olivia for very good minutes. I have emailed to ask if they could be supplied in hard copy, because I think they were extremely good and very full, and I think it would be helpful at our next discussion. I would also like to thank you, Chair, for chairing the meeting, the workshop we had, which I think drew in a great deal of ideas and comments, which I think were very helpful and were reported in those minutes. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I'd also like to mention item 18. I'm going to be banging on again because I'm concerned about the survey, but you have spoken to me about it, so thank you very much for that. And possibly we may be able to speak about that at the workshop on Thursday.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. There's no actual comments on the accuracy of these minutes that we've got before us, though.
I think they're accurate, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So can I take those as agreed? Thank you. Item 9, presentation of petitions, and there are none. Item 10, question and answer session for members of the public, and there are none. Item 11, question from members to the chairman, and I'll say that there are none, although we can pick up, as you say, we can pick up elsewhere the question we sort of were just out of time on. Item 12, the committee work programme, which is set out on, he says now trying to work out what page it is, because 5, is it? Okay, I can't really see it from here. I believe, looking at this, I should look to Mrs. Woodhouse, who is going to just give us an update on that very subject that Councillor Mrs. Rose was just talking about.
Thank you, Chairman. So the working group has held one meeting last week, and a model in principle has come forward from that working group. So we've got a follow-up meeting on Thursday this week, where we're going to look at some additional information and answer some further questions that have come out of that model development. There are plans for a survey to go out to all members, so that's how we're looking to engage a wider group of councillors in the conversation. And we're also going to be holding an all-member briefing, and the date for that's looking like 2nd of September. And that'll be an evening briefing as well, so we can engage as many people as possible before a report comes to Democracy and General Purposes on 8th of September.
Okay, excellent. Are there any comments or questions on that? Councillor Mrs. Joy.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you just repeat the date? I didn't quite catch it.
Sorry, 2nd of September, and that'll be in the evening.
Is that Councillor Cook?
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted clarification in terms of the work group that people were referring to, presumably relates to the one that was set up and is item 17 on the minutes that we just approved, which is the executive arrangements. The survey work, I thought, was for the whole council arrangements. I'm probably they're separate things, aren't they? So there's not a work group working on the whole council arrangements. Okay, thank you.
No, sorry, just to clarify, we're talking about a survey in respect amongst members in respect of the working group, as opposed to the whole council elections sort of survey, which has gone out to, I think, 15,000 doors, which is sort of a somewhat different exercise in nature, as you might imagine. Would anyone else like to make a comment or question on the work programme? Can I take it that the work programme is agreed then? Excellent. Right, item 13, reports of outside bodies, and there are none, which brings us to item 14, which is a member agenda item request on full council meeting arrangements by request by Councillor Harper. And whilst it's not on my notes, I believe ordinarily what happens at this point is I look to my right and a Democratic Services officer will explain what the procedure is for a member agenda item request. Or is that dropping you in it?
Evening, members. Apologies in advance for the amount of talking I'm going to do tonight. So the process for a member agenda item request is that a councillor asks for an item to be considered by a committee. The committee then decides whether or not it wishes to take that item forward to a full report from officers at its next meeting, where the issue will be looked at in detail. So the discussion and decision tonight would simply be to decide whether to take it forward to report stage or not, or whether you're happy that the item doesn't require a report and whatever is currently happening with that item is sufficient. Thank you.
Okay, so I then look to Councillor Cooper to introduce his item.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I requested this on the back of our most recent full council meeting, and I think members around the table will probably agree that the venue and the style of meeting was fairly inadequate. Now, I'm not pointing the finger at anyone because I think we've had a very difficult sort of 18 months and we're suddenly getting back to normal working practices which aren't quite normal. But I don't think meetings in the leisure centre, and this is me speaking personally, are ideal. Microphones often didn't work. We were in a room which really wasn't set up for that. What I would like to see from a report is a bit of clarity about how we move forwards. Now, it's clear at the moment for committee meetings, this room works quite well. I don't think it's ideal. I'm not keen on the screens, for instance, but it works well. It might not work as well for a full council meeting, given the current circumstances. And I appreciate that at the moment that might not be an ideal option. However, we do have to ask the question, if not now, when? And in the meantime, what are our arrangements going to be? Are we going to continue using Maidstone Leisure Centre or the County Showground for council meetings, given that we know that they are expensive options that come at the cost of the taxpayer, and they are inadequate? I don't think they allow for proper debate. I don't think they are a comfortable setting for us. Or should we seek some sort of compromise? One alternative that's been suggested is perhaps we should use, if we are able to, Kent County Council's chamber, which is larger, would allow for social distancing, and at least has proper acoustics and would be potentially a better setting. So what I'm after in such a report is 2 points, really. First and foremost, a bit of a roadmap as to when we could get back to normal, if we're ever going to get back to normal. I've never been in here with every member crammed in. It can be a little bit, sometimes at JTB it seems hemmed in. But if we're not going back to normal yet, when? And secondly, what are we going to do in the meantime? Because it might be another 6 months, it might be another 9 months. We can't carry on like that. So I'm hoping that everyone gets a sense of what I'm asking for, rather than insisting that we go back to an old way of working that perhaps some members are less comfortable with than others. So hopefully that is fairly clear what I'm after.
I was wondering whether I might be able to bring Mr. O'Connell in on this, because I know that he obviously has been working on these matters.
Thank you, Chairman. I think we need to reflect on how council meetings run in this chamber and the fact that I think crammed is probably the correct word. I think most members who have been at one of our council meetings would have experienced trying to pass behind somebody else to get to your seat, and the fact that these arms on these chairs actually rub against and overlap with each other. So when we're talking about, you know, things being close or not socially distanced or those sort of things, and we also need to consider things like ventilation, and if you're not socially distanced, whether or not masks are applicable or not, which can cause difficulties, particularly with people speaking at things like council meetings. So what we've done is we've taken the lessons learned from both Moat Hall at the Leisure Centre and the Exhibition Hall at Detling. The main feedback from the Leisure Centre was that it worked well, but people weren't comfortable looking at each other's backs and weren't sure which way to face. So we've explored the traditional face-to-face approach, which we would normally have in the chamber, at least 2 sword widths apart, of course, which is socially distanced as well. That would seem to be possible. So that is one option that we've got as our plan B. Our other plan that we're looking at the moment is exploring the use of County Hall, as you've highlighted. There are a couple of issues with that. One is that KCC aren't actually hiring it out currently, so I'm in conversations with them to see whether or not they can make an exception for us or not. I really don't know how likely that is, because they also, as you'll be aware, opted not to use it for their own meeting just last week, which was post the 19th with the relaxation of measures. They decided to have their own council meeting in the Leisure Centre as well. So with that in mind, I think whilst we may all think that County Hall is a suitable solution for us, given I think it can hold about 103 people, excluding the public gallery, so it would seem to be certainly a lot more spacious than this room would be. If it's not available, then there's not much we can do about that. So I think we've got a sort of an option A and an option B. I'm not even necessarily putting them in a particular order at the moment, between those 2 sites, taking on board the lessons learned and making sure that we have that arena where people can debate sufficiently. Whatever the decision is, it needs to be taken in the best balance of factors for the meeting and to ensure all members feel and this is particularly important to us in democratic services, that all members feel able to attend and comfortable in attending, particularly, for example, in September, where we have the potential for an extraordinary meeting to be held post the normal meeting to look at whole council elections, so we'd want to make sure everybody can attend for that. And obviously, any of those considerations and decisions would be consulted through group leaders. And in terms of the costs, yes, there is a cost. There's a cost whichever external venue we hire because of webcasting and the audio equipment that needs to be provided. What I would say is that those costs, while it is still money, those costs can be charged to COVID grant and to what is known as comp funding, because it is an adjustment in response to COVID. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, before I bring anybody in, and so far I've got Annabel, Clive and Councillors Blackmore, English and Cook indicating. Obviously, Councillor Cooper, it is down to you whether you move for a report. What I'd like to suggest, if this works for people, is that as many people as possible put their views on the record, and we then just allow Mr. O'Connell to take that away, given that he's already working on this subject, rather than us necessarily having a report to come back to this committee. Now, before I come to Mrs. Blackmore, I believe I'm supposed to, as Councillor Hastie has joined us, I believe I'm supposed to ask whether for any disclosures of lobbying or anything like that, and declarations of interest.
No, thank you.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Councillor Mrs. Blackmore.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. O'Connell, for your summary, and thank you, Councillor Cooper, for the question. The whole situation is far from ideal, and I do think officers have explored so many different options. The exhibition hall didn't work because there's no loop, and I think for anyone who has a hearing aid, they really struggled badly on that day. To such an extent, I think there were certainly one or two members I came across who were quite distressed. So the exhibition hall, frankly, is a non-starter. I agree that the layout with the leisure centre didn't work very well, but I think if you take it as a venue and a space and the fact it's easy to park, which again, for some of our members who need assistance, it's ideal. I think the leisure centre would be very hard to beat. County Hall, I do think we're going to have parking issues. However, I'm sure there's someone who would disagree with that. I also am a little bit perturbed that we need a report to come back to the committee. Can we not make a decision this evening? Because I think if we can look at the leisure centre and maybe just look at a different layout, as Mr. O'Connell has said, surely that would be a simpler way to make the decision. I'm just a little bit concerned if we end up with a report, is it going to be here in September? By the time we've made the decision, well, we've lost the September council meetings. So I think if there's anything we can do, re-protocol, to push it along, maybe, as Mr. O'Connell has said, he's already looking at other formats. He's got an intelligent team with him. I'm sure they will find the best possible solution. Maybe that means, I don't know, rows of 4 on each side, so we can be beautifully spaced. As you say, our 2 swords apart would be the simplest solution. That would be my preference, Chairman, rather than having a report to the committee, etc.
Okay, thank you. Councillor English.
I was lucky, I suppose, in my holiday time, in that I didn't actually get to go to this meeting at the Leisure Centre. It sounds like I missed a delightful evening. All I would say is that I think I understand where Councillor Cooper's coming from, and like some other people, I've felt that some of the arrangements that we've, of necessity, had to adopt were suboptimal, but as I say, they were of necessity. if a report, as it sounds like, is effectively already being worked on, it would seem duplication of effort to have another report submitted. But I would say that we do, having been to meetings at County Hall in the past, if it were available, I actually think it's quite a good venue, but if it's not available, it's not available, you know. I actually would find that quite easy to walk to, but so that wouldn't be a parking problem for me, but that's a bit selfish, I suppose. But it is actually, compared to a lot of places in Maidstone, relatively easy to reach. But if parking is the main issue, the leisure centre, when it's not in use for other things, is easy to park in, assuming that the roads outside aren't being dug up. What we have to do is just try and adapt to the situation. But if we are able to, you know, use technology to make access available for people who would otherwise not be able to attend, then for whatever council meeting it is, then we should actually see that as an opportunity, because that could actually improve access for certain sections of the public who would not otherwise be able to access our meetings, simply either because they live too far away and there's not adequate public transport, or because they've got disability issues. So we should actually see, whilst we're looking at our arrangements, we shouldn't just be looking at our own convenience. We should be looking at, actually, in this situation, can we actually improve public access, or access for councillors in the future who may not be, you know, maybe in a wheelchair or be blind or whatever, and see that we can actually improve our accessibility, so not see this as an entirely negative experience.
Thank you, Councillor English. So I've then got Councillor Cooper, Councillor Cook, and then Councillor Joy.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a lot of sympathy with what Councillor Cooper is saying, and I appreciate the comments that Clive English has just mentioned relative to the use of County Hall and the council chamber at Sessions House, where, of course, when we have when KCC holds a full council meeting, there are 81 members that arrive, many from all over the different parts of Kent, and car parking tends to not be a problem. There's plenty of car parking there. There are 3 car parks that are dedicated for that purpose, so I think that is overcomable. I think the social distancing is not a requirement now, but it is clearly something that we want to be conscious of, and we don't want members or officers or members of the public to feel imposed upon by that. So I think we need to go forward cautiously still, and I think that is sort of the guidance. Looking further ahead in terms of the numbers that we have in this authority, of course we might have it within our own remit when we get to item 17 to bring things down to a number that are far more accommodative, that this room can accommodate far easier. But that's something we'll deal with when we get to there. I'm content to leave this with the officers, let them come up with something for September. But I do ask that it be noted that we can't just go on with alternative arrangements. We do need at some point to draw a line in the sand and say, as Councillor Cooper said when he stole the words of the Prime Minister, if not now, then when? And I do think that that's what, you know, I feel strongly about that we need to show leadership in the sense of returning to a state of normality as best we can, as soon as we can. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs Joy.
Thank you. I agree with what's said over that side of the room for once. First of all, I do agree as well that we need to think about moving forward at some point. However, I have to agree with Councillor Blackmore. The leisure centre wasn't that bad. I think the arrangements for us to be face to face will help no end. So until we can sort ourselves out properly, and if County Hall isn't available, then I think we should go down the line of giving the leisure centre another go with the adjustments that the democratic services will make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I've got Councillor Perry next, and then Councillor Mrs Rose.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I actually agree with what Councillor Joy has just said, actually, is what I was going to say, because I think the exhibition hall was not great, let's be honest about it. But the leisure centre, it has very good parking, it's good access, so that I think that's very good. If the layout can be improved in some way, then I think that's something that should be looked at, and I think it's something the officers, I'm sure, are very capable of doing. I do like the idea of County Hall. I think that's a nice idea as well, and so if that was a possibility, then that could be alternative. So I really think it's down to those two, really. Either we stay with the leisure centre and try and rejig it a bit. I didn't, because it did feel a bit like sitting in an exam room, you know, and I know it's difficult, this, so, and I think everybody was doing their best, so it's not a criticism, but if that could be improved and it could be some form of face-to-face, the leisure centre seems to be a very good option. So I think, I agree with Councillor Cook as well, leave it to the officers. I think, you know, you've got all the details, you've got the experience of trying to organise this, you know what we think about it, so I think I have every confidence that you can resolve this, and I think we need to resolve it fairly quickly. I agree with that. We shouldn't be messing around. So I think that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Perry. Councillor Mrs Rose.
I'd just like to agree with Councillor Perry and Councillor Joy. Also, just to say that there was information given for our last full council meeting at the leisure centre, and you can't ask people to have a lateral COVID test, but it was requested, and I would like to feel that we could trust and have confidence with our colleagues as councillors to be able to have that. I popped along to Sessions House. Within half an hour, I was told I was okay, I was negative, and that was okay. So maybe if we are whatever meeting, wherever we're going to meet, possibly the request might be made again, just to pop along and have a lateral test, just so that we can all be assured that everybody that comes to the meeting is negative. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. What I'd just say for my part is that I thought the leisure centre was a great improvement on the Detling Showground. I think I said at the time I couldn't see a thing. I know other people, I think Councillor Blackmore made the point about a couple of members who couldn't hear anything. Well, I couldn't see anything. And at least with the way that the leisure centre was laid out, I was quite close to the mayor. I could just sort of look at the mayor and actually at least have something to focus on, to focus on. So it wasn't that bad. It was a bit of a walk, and I remember walking round and past a certain street sign and thinking, you know, this was after about my 2-mile walk, and thinking to myself, Councillor Mrs Joy, it must be convenient for her. And obviously on that note, obviously County Hall I really would have to commend County Hall as a location, because that would be 5 minutes from me. But more importantly, as we all know, it's next to a train station, and of course if we're all into sustainable travel as we should be, then obviously having a meeting place next to a train station, I think that's a good excuse. Maybe the Twin Hatter county members present could actually lobby the county to try and make this available for us. Now, on that happy note, if I think we've done that item quite well, and so if you're content, Councillor Cooper, I propose that Mr O'Connell will have made his notes and we then move on.
Yep, I am indeed content. I don't want to waste time and money on a report, never have really, but I'm very reassured by what he said, and I think there is a strength of feeling in this room that with some moderate improvements we can sort of get there. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. So moving on, we come to item 15, which is the Workforce Strategy Update Report, and Balsanda is going to present this for us, and I believe she's joining us remotely.
Thank you. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. So the Workforce Strategy Report is for noting. It provides an update against the action plan, which has been regularly reviewed and amended throughout the year. Progress has been achieved against all 4 themes of the workforce strategy as outlined in the report. And the key things I would like to highlight include the new guidance that's been drafted for managers. And this guidance has been produced to allow managers to explore opportunities with their teams on the kind of different working styles that are now available, and that is based on our kind of work experience during lockdown. We're also reviewing the organisational culture, and this is again based on our current working practices and how we want this to be developed for the future. And from this piece of work, we are looking to create a culture change programme for the organisation to achieve the outcomes outlined under section 2.2.2 on page 8 and 9 of the report. We've also introduced a new engagement group, and this is made up of staff across the council. The aim of the group is to set the engagement agenda for the council by sharing their ideas and concerns, and to also take a lead in implementing those ideas. The One Council event was held virtually on the 3rd of March, and this was with all staff. And this also included the annual staff awards, which took place to recognise the contributions made by staff, especially during the pandemic period. The ongoing support that we've been providing in relation to absence management, recruitment, starters and leavers have been summarised on pages 10 and 11 of the report. We did see a drop in recruitment activity during the lockdown period, but recruitment levels are now back to similar levels pre-pandemic. Our contract for our HR payroll system called iTrent has been renewed, and this has involved moving the system from on-site premises to a cloud-hosted environment. This has been successfully achieved within a very short timescale, which meant payroll processing continued as normal for all 3 councils. We have continued with our programme of webinars for staff to support their well-being, as well as helping them to understand more about working from home and again thinking about their well-being, and guidance to managers on managing remote teams. The training plan for this year has also been agreed, and this includes various training courses to support the needs of staff as well as managers. And the training plan will include a mix of face-to-face and online training, and again that's from our experience of working within the lockdown period and what's worked well for staff. We've continued to meet our public sector requirement for the number of apprentices we need within the workplace. Currently we have 7 apprentices employed at the council and 7 employees studying for a professional qualification as part of the apprenticeship scheme. We've also delivered our first virtual wellbeing week in February. We normally would hold these events in the office, but due to COVID-19 we designed the week to enable staff to take part in events that focused on wellbeing, mental health, as well as team building activities, because we recognised that as the people, a lot of staff, most staff are working remotely, that kind of team building and team communication has kind of been lost. So we try to develop some kind of team building activities to allow that conversation to take place. And feedback from the staff was positive about the events that were offered during the week. There's also been a number of wellbeing events promoted over the last few months, and again these have been outlined in section 2.52 of the report, which is page 13. And the action plan has been updated and can be found in Appendix 1. Is there any questions?
No.
Councillor English.
Oh, what's wrong?
Oh.
Thank you.
Councillor English, over to you.
Right. I think it's a tribute to the comprehensive nature of this report, and it's the sheer amount of information that is valuably included in there that is actually quite hard to think of a question that hasn't been covered. So I'm usually not stumped for questions, but I'm actually struggling for one. So thank you for a very comprehensive report.
Are there any other members with points or questions? Oh, Councillor Mrs Joy.
Again, a comment, just to say, as I'm subbing tonight, it was a very thorough report, and I think it's good that we know as members what's going on within the team. So I just want to say congratulations that things are getting back to normal and everyone's being looked after. So thank you.
Thank you. I must say, I also found it quite comprehensive, and I was reading through it on Saturday, and I had to read this one 2 or 3 times. Maybe I was hungover or something, but it was just a sort of lot of detail in there. The point that I noted, which I was actually very pleased by, was the decline in the sickness rate, and I thought that was very, very good, especially if you note the comment here on page 10 about how in previous years we lost 871 days for mental health due to anxiety and stress, and from the graph that appears now to be under 300 days, and I think that's a significant improvement, and I think that's really got to be welcomed. Now the report is for noting. Are we content to note that, then, members? No. Excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mrs Sander.
Thank you.
Right. So we move on then to item 16, Honorary Alderman status and the possibility of an exceptional award, which is on pages 20 to 24 of the bundle. And firstly, I'm going to look to Mr O'Connell to introduce this report.
Thank you, Chairman. This report asks the committee to recommend to Council that the exceptional circumstances for former Councillor Wendy Hinder be taken into account in order to enable the Honorary Alderman process to be followed. I hope the committee don't mind, but from this point on I shall refer to Wendy Hinder as Wendy, which is something she insisted I do face to face, and it feels a bit more respectful. Wendy passed away in February 2020 whilst in the office of Deputy Mayor, a few months shy of having served for 16 years as a councillor. Therefore, the nomination would not meet the criteria of the agreed Honorary Alderman protocol. It was a carefully thought out protocol and not one that we should amend lightly. However, Wendy's circumstances are such that an exceptional case can be made without amending the protocol. Had Wendy completed her deputy mayoral year, she would have met the 16 years, and then she would have gone on to be mayor. Then as a former mayor, she would have had the civic rights that brings. Those rights are the same in function as those afforded to an honorary alderman. I therefore recommend the exceptional circumstances on that basis. Lastly, a date has not yet been set for the special meeting to consider any motion for honorary alderman status to be awarded. I have not suggested September 2021, as that evening will already likely have a council meeting and possibly a special council meeting on the same evening, depending on what is agreed in September by this committee. I also understand there is a memorial planned in October 2021 for Wendy, so if the committee agree the recommendation, we will work with the relevant members to agree a suitable date for that meeting and any consideration of the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr O'Connell. Now, before I open it to the committee, could I ask whether either of our visiting members would like to speak? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I have Councillor Mrs Blackmore first.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd be very happy to move this motion in respect of Wendy Hinder. And I think if we could have all of this agreed prior to the memorial service, I think everybody would be deeply grateful. And I don't think there's anything else to say other than there's an exception to every rule and every guideline. And that's why I'm more than happy to support this. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to second that from the chair, if I may. I have Councillor Cook next.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm one of those people that thinks that all rules are there to be broken if the rationale is appropriate to break the rules. As somebody who has known or knew Wendy for many, many years, I think this is one of those times when I'm really happy to break the rules, but really sad that we're having to do it in this way. And but I can't think of anybody that meets that criteria to do this. And I totally support Councillor Mrs. Blackmore's suggestion that let's have this in place and done if we possibly can by the time of the memorial service. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Mrs. Rose next, and then Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Chair. I'm delighted that this should be happening. Unfortunately, I didn't know Councillor Wendy Hinder very well, but delighted about that. But I have been, as I mentioned, I have been asked by Councillor Harper to raise 2 points. The first is the criteria, which he feels would be better to be 12 years rather than the 16 that I think has been put forward. And also a possible question of whether in future, and not now, but in future, possibly we could reward those servants of the council either posthumously or in life by making them freemen of the council. Possibly that may be more appropriate. So those are the comments that I've been asked to give from Councillor Harper.
Okay, thank you very much there. Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, well, I'm very happy to break the rules as well, really happy to do that. Wendy was a marvellous councillor and she did a huge amount for this council. But I'm very sorry that we have to actually make an exception and break the rules, because I think the rules are slightly wrong, if you want my honest opinion. We shouldn't be having to break them. This is not a long service award. You know, we give people clocks and watches for a long service award. This is different. And I think we've gone down a slightly wrong track, which is why I appreciate Councillor Rose here, because I think she's on the right track, and Councillor Harper. So this was a bit of a mistake. I don't really understand the wording in 2.6 where he said this was a carefully considered protocol. I remember being present when this was discussed at the council, and if I recall, it came right at the end of a rather tired and difficult debate, and I think somehow it crept in. It's not right. 16 years is ludicrous, particularly in the current circumstances. So what I would like to say is we approve, obviously, what is being recommended. I'm not going to challenge that, although I actually think option 2 is the more correct. But I think what we should do as a committee is perhaps take the opportunity to review this, maybe at a slightly later date, and then we can consider what is the better way of considering this protocol in the future. So that's what I would like to propose. Obviously, we want to support what's being for Wendy, and so that must be done as soon as possible, and I totally agree with that. But I think we need to address this properly, and because it's not right as it is. It's clearly not right, and that's why this has happened, in fact. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Perry. Councillor Hastie.
Thank you. I agree with Councillor Rose. I was looking into it, and this is absolutely no disrespect to Wendy, but when they look at sort of civic ceremonial protocol, and we did use a lot of that when we decided on the Honorary Alderman title before, that it should be, as it's a posthumous award, it should be an honorary freeman of the borough rather than an alderman, and I'm happy for that.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Mrs. Joy next, and then Councillor English.
Thank you. It's always difficult, isn't it, when something like this comes forward and there's a personal name behind something, and I think that's what makes it really, really difficult. However, I've got to... I don't very often disagree with Councillor Perry, but I was on that committee, as was Councillor Blackmore. And my recollection of that, a bit like an elephant who doesn't forget, we did spend an awful long time about the years. And I believe it was Councillor Blackmore that said 16 years, and I think I probably put my hand up and second for the start, yes. So, as much as everyone thinks, there was an awful lot of talk or decision-making before we didn't just pluck it out of the air. It took an awful lot of discussion and debate. Now, where I'm going with this is, everyone loved Wendy as much as I love Bob and everything else, so I'm really not being difficult here, but all I'm saying is, as a one-off, because of the circumstances, then yes. But what I really would feel uncomfortable about is if we suddenly said, well, we'll change it now to 12, or we'll change it, because that isn't what we're here for tonight. It is totally a one-off, in my opinion. And that's how it should be looked at, and not suddenly just saying it needs changing. Sorry, Councillor Perry.
Okay. Councillor English, please.
Well, actually, I think there is a slight systemic problem, but Councillor Joy is right. We can't. It's always wrong to amend carefully considered things on the hoof. So let's not do that. But Councillor Perry, I don't think, was suggesting that. What I think he was suggesting was that we should look at whether there are other exceptional circumstances, and there may well be other exceptional circumstances. And secondly, what do you do if someone of really exemplary character who's made a huge impact on the borough, or for whatever reason, here's a hypothetical case, they work for an organisation which requires them to move across the country, but in their 10 years service to the Borough Council, they've made an impact more than someone else would ever make in 20 years. So I think there are issues to be considered, but like with all changes, to carefully considered, and it was discussed at great length, as Councillor Joy said, although there was, I think, one amendment to it that hadn't been discussed particularly in advance, but most of it had been very carefully thought about. But with new proposals, it's always the things you don't think about, the unexpected tragedies, the accidents and disasters that happen that you just didn't think about. So I think we do need to consider this further at some point, but, you know, actually suggesting solutions as to changing years or whatever is putting the cart before the horse. So I think we should consider it as an issue in the future, but not now. So this is true. So back to this evening's decision. I knew Wendy quite well, very well, in fact, and I think it's been a loss for the community and the council, family, friends. And it is, I think, an exceptional situation. God, I really hope it's an exceptional situation. So, you know, but I think we do need to consider it, but in a careful manner.
Councillor Mrs Rose, would you like to come back? Sorry.
It's a rather awkward situation to discuss this at this moment, but I agree with Councillor Perry and Councillor English, and I hope that possibly we can revisit this at another time, please.
Okay, well, given that we've got the motion on the table moved by Mrs Blackmore, and Councillor Mrs Blackmore, and seconded by myself, what I'd like to suggest is that we press ahead with, or, you know, that we look to agree that, and then maybe sort of in the work programme, if space allows, then later on in the year we can deal with the more general issue of whether we want to review, and we can have a good conversation about that then. and then just focus for tonight's purposes on them sort of the particular exceptional circumstances in front of us. So, if I may put the motion, is that agreed, members? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Councillor Hinder and I know Wendy's close friend, Councillor Brindle for coming tonight as well. Thank you. Right, item 17. Local Government Boundary Review Council Size Submission, which is on pages 25 to 47 of your bundle. And again, this is going to be introduced by Mr. O'Connell.
Yes, Chairman, sorry. This report provides the committee with the template on the council size submission and sets out how we recommend it is completed, with some elements being completed by officers and some through working with councillors in facilitated sessions with the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny. Obviously, any submission in all stages of the submission will come to members for consideration and ultimately recommendation to council. The two proposed facilitated sessions would be on a focus on size factors, so community leadership, i.e. the role of a ward councillor, which is clearly something that councillors know far better than officers would, and the context of how councillors see the authority run in 15 to 20 years' time. Session 2 would then focus on size options, so looking at the different sizes councillors want to rule out, as well as the size that they would prefer. So determining council size is an important starting point for the boundary review, and it is impacted by the whole council elections work, but significantly impacted by the executive arrangements work, which is currently underway. The outputs from that will be fed in as shown in the timetable, because we need to dovetail those pieces of work together. Whilst I've yet to confirm the dates with the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, because I was waiting for a decision to be made here tonight, we do have the dates of the 7th of September and the 30th of September lined up with the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny. What I will say, and what you may have noticed from some of the discussion earlier on the committee work programme, is that September is a very, very busy month for briefings and updates and committee meetings for councillors. So I wanted to make the committee aware of that, because there are several pieces of work coming together at the same time. The Centre for Governance and Scrutiny have recommended physical sessions, which we will invite all councillors to. I will look at how we can safely run those in the chamber and room B, and possibly even using the mayor's parlour if we have to, perhaps supplemented by remote access in this room. Agreeing the timetable will also amend the committee work programme, as the report on the review will not be presented to the next meeting. Instead, that meeting will concentrate on the executive arrangements and whole council elections, which are already programmed to be considered then. I'd also like to highlight that individuals or groups can independently make their own submission to the Local Government Boundary Commission for England. I don't propose to take any part in those, but if anybody wishes to, they can do so. I have spent quite a lot of time reading through multiple other submissions from other councils, so if anybody's got any questions, I'm quite happy to take them. Thank you.
Councillor Mrs. Blackmore.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. I thought someone else would have indicated. I'm looking at the timetable, and it's really tight, isn't it? And I'm under the impression that there is no room for slippage. So unless someone has come up with another option, I'd be happy to move the comments on the paper, read the approach and the timetable which is outlined, because I think if we decide to make any changes, it's not going to happen given the time frame. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Yeah. I think that was a question, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I mean, there would be options. For example, you can ask officers to complete it in full as best they can and bring it back without those sessions. But I think in order to have something meaningful that councillors can properly own as their submission, in order to decide on the size that councillors want, I think we need to make sure we're picking up on those bits with as much councillor involvement as possible. In which case, yes, I would obviously recommend the timetable that's there and say that it can't slip. We've already agreed an extension with the Local Government Boundary Commission to have the decision in December rather than November. So we've already kind of pushed it in that respect. Thank you, Chairman.
I'd like to come back on that.
I would, thank you, Chairman. I think when the Local Boundary Commission gave their presentation a while ago, they were quite specific about it has to be decided by November, and then I think you've got to put it in your budget for February, etc., etc. So I take your point, Mr. O'Connell, but I was actually going to say, is it possible to tweak it at all? And it sounds as if it isn't. So yeah, I have absolutely no problems with recommending this, and I wholeheartedly agree with you that if you don't invite members to participate, there's going to be loads of people who will be really unhappy and very, very vocal, and it could be a roller coaster ride. So well done. I thoroughly agree, and I'm still happy to move the motion or move the papers, the recommendation on the papers, Chairman.
Thank you. And I know Councillor Cook is seconding. Would like to speak, Councillor?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just very, very briefly. As somebody who sat on a similar committee in another place and has been through this process before, when the County Council was reduced from 85 to 81 members, I would urge member involvement, certainly. I think that's absolutely essential. I think the level of involvement that's being proposed here is appropriate. I do recognise that we're trying to squeeze a pint into a half-pint pot from a timescale point of view to a large extent. But if we aren't going to make our own representations as to the size of the council going forward, the Boundary Commission will do that for us. So I think it's absolutely essential that we put forward these arguments, and as the officer has pointed out, from a political point of view, the different groups have the opportunity, as do local associations and any resident as well, can make representations to the Boundary Commission on what they think is appropriate for the size of Maidstone Borough Council going forward. So I fully support option one, and I'm delighted to second what Councillor Mrs Blackmore moved. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Cook. Are there any more? Councillor English.
Given that the size of the council is in a way directly related to what governance arrangements we will have, just making sure the two timetables are going to mesh, are they? They look to be quite tight but doable. But if we don't have the answer to the second question, we might not be able to fill in the form for the first.
Indeed, yes. I don't know if you want to come back on that at all, Mr. O'Connell.
I've worked to tighter timetables in the past, so I'm confident we can deliver it as long as there are no delays at any point in any of the processes.
Excellent. So, members, is that agreed? Okay. Excellent, thank you. Now, I think I was getting a bit confused where I was on my agenda, but we are now on to item 18, which is the completely different commission, which is the Parliamentary Constituencies and the Boundary Commission for England consultation. Although, once again, I will look to Mr. O'Connell to introduce this.
I'm really sorry at this point. It's clearly the season for reviewing boundaries, with the Boundary Commission for England consulting on its new proposals for parliamentary constituencies, with the previous new parliamentary constituencies having fallen at the final hurdle. So the proposals for the Borough of Maidstone create 3 constituencies that cover the borough, and based on electorate totals, we would be the lead authority for all 3. The new constituencies cross over into Ashford, Swale, Tunbridge and Malling and Tunbridge Wells, creating a situation where there would be 5 councils working together to deliver 3 parliamentary constituencies. Fortunately, the exhibition hall is nice and large. Obviously, we discussed its dimensions somewhat earlier, but that's where it's advantageous. The suggested response sets out the considerations in looking at the proposals and the concerns that those raise. They broadly relate to the functioning of the constituencies in terms of community identity and representation, and the implications for the running of parliamentary elections in a complicated setup. Whilst I appreciate that putting together boundary proposals for the country and the South East is extremely complicated, it does feel a bit as though Maidstone has been something of an afterthought in the practicality of what is proposed, perhaps due to our location in Kent, or from the Boundary Commission working inwards from the coastal areas, but the split across the borough into 3 does not feel comfortable or practical. The recommended response, therefore, proposes that we object, because you have to either agree or object, they've been quite clear on that, and puts forward a set of principles to be applied in any alternative, and a practical demonstration of those principles in creating 2 constituencies that have an identity and applies some local knowledge on the ground. I fully acknowledge that these are just one configuration of many possible configurations that are possible, but any proposal should have some geographic and community coherency. We do have available, if members, when asking questions, need anything put up on the screen, we can present the boundaries in more detail, or even have a play if members want to. But beyond that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. And I've got Councillor Cooper first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ryan. There are no 2 words more dreaded by a Conservative Party Association chairman than boundary review. Today I've spoken to Helen Grant, Helen Whately and Damien Green because they're having a row about which wards should go into which constituency. Not that it is necessarily within their gifts anyway. I understand that this row extends further into other proposed constituencies. I'm also confident that if I went around this room, and I'm not proposing that I am going to do this, but if I went around this room, we would all have a slightly different expert opinion on which boundary should go where, based solely on personal experience, and none of those views are incorrect. We all have a reason for doing it. I mean, I had a long conversation with Councillor Cook about it, and I've had a long conversation with Councillor Pearl about it. So we have 3 options, essentially. We can either agree to agree the consultation response, which is suggested here, and it's a perfectly decent consultation response, but not necessarily something that I would be in agreement with. We could not object and submit a consultation response in support of the proposals. And it is like building houses. Everyone agrees something needs to be done, but it mustn't be done to them. Or we could go for option 3. And Mr. Chairman, I think you know where I'm going. I propose actually we do take option 3, which is not to submit a consultation response, but also not to accept the recommendations foisted upon us. And that's not because I think we should remain silent on matters. It's because there is no way that we're ever going to agree a response between ourselves, because if members of the same political party have fundamental disagreements over the placement of one particular ward, how on earth are we going to agree with Councillor Joy, Councillor Rose, Councillor English and Councillor Hasty and anyone else who wants to give an opinion? So that I move that we take option 3, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. And Councillor Perry was indicating, was that to second Councillor Cooper's motion, was it?
Yes, I second what Councillor Cooper said, and I totally support everything he said, actually. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I've got Councillor Mrs Blackmore to speak next.
So 3 MPs from Maidstone. We've got 2 at the moment. We've got 4 motorway junctions. Lucky old us, it all happens here. It's bad enough working with 2 MPs. How on earth the Borough Council is going to work with 3? It's completely bonkers, but clearly someone sat there with all their little pins around and they've had great fun. If only they could have invited us to the party. I find Councillor Cooper's stance on this really tricky. I just feel if you abstain, if you say nothing, then whatever it is gets done to you and you have no choice. I don't like the fact that we wouldn't be putting forward an opinion, because we're quite a strongly opinionated council. And I'm quite proud of that. So I think to say nothing, I just don't really agree with that. It doesn't sit well with me. Unless someone can give me a strong, reasoned, coherent reason, too many reasons in there, why we should say nothing, then please do. But at this moment in time, I think we should come down strongly on the side of we don't agree. What's wrong with the status quo? Because it's all very well saying, okay, it doesn't work in some parts, but surely in Maidstone it works reasonably well. So I would rather have it left as it is. Or, if you're going to change it, then just have one MP for Maidstone and the surrounding villages and be done. And follow the borough council boundary.
Before I come to Councillor English, I know Mr O'Connell wishes to jump it, to make a comment. I would just make my own comment that what you're suggesting there would leave the voters grossly underrepresented, and that is why we have these boundary review things happening, to try and even up the constituencies. Mr O'Connell.
I think despite the fact that we've now had 2 parliamentary constituency reviews in the space of a few years, these things aren't meant to come along very often. So it's about whether or not we want to take the opportunity to have a say. I fully understand where Councillor Cooper is coming from, because I myself, having a play with working very hard at the planning system to have a look at different wards, could have come up with any number of permutations on what is possible, but that's why I tried to put forward the principles first. And the reason why I came up with a specific proposal was because the consultation response rules require one, but I thought it was a way of sort of delivering those principles so that when the Boundary Commission are reviewing the consultation responses that they've received, and they're having to do all that work from coast to coast and all over the place, they can take those principles into account in when they're looking at those consultation responses. Because otherwise, I think I could take the rather cynical view that it's one of those consultations where you could just say, well, everyone's got a different opinion and we've got so many different ones that actually we'll just do what we want anyway. So I think we need to be setting out those principles, although I entirely accept trying to get all-round 100% agreement to a suggestion is probably, on hiding to nothing. My issue with the status quo is if you look at what this boundary review is trying to achieve and what I think is important in democratic representation, for example, when we look at our own boundaries with things like community identity, is if you look at the existing parliamentary constituencies, they do have some serious flaws. So Faversham and Mid-Kent ranges from Shepway North, Shepway South and Parkwood all the way up the A249 across to Faversham. The notion that they identify with those, either end of those, identify with the other communities at the end, removing any politics from it at all, but just on that principle, seems to me to be flawed. And so this is an opportunity to have a go at correcting that as far as possible and having a say. And I think it's important that we take that opportunity and that principle to, setting out those principles, fully accepting that the actual individual demonstration of how those could be applied, which is what I've tried to do, could be something completely different by the end of it. And we're unlikely to agree on what that should be. And I'm certainly not precious about what's being put forward. But what I would also say, because I think it's important for the committee to note, is that if the committee do decide not to put representation in, then the returning officer certainly intends to put a consultation response in independently, focusing on the election complications and implications of having 3 parliamentary constituencies across 5 different councils being run at the same time, because clearly that does raise and increase the risks around statutory timescales that there are with parliamentary elections on election night. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr O'Connell. And yes, of course, parliamentary elections must be run for the benefit of the election staff. Councillor English.
Whilst I don't think that was quite what the officer meant. Running an election is a complicated thing, and we have seen from experience elsewhere in the world that it can even be a dangerous thing. But fortunately, we haven't had a situation in this country where election staff are being threatened with death just for running a fair election, but that is happening around the world. should take into account that the actual mechanics of running an election are actually quite important. And whilst we have a view as members, a returning officer quite legitimately should have a view on how easy or otherwise it is to run an election. That's their job. In terms of our role as community representatives, we could decide not to make a response. That's a response in itself, in a way, not making a response. But I would say that I frequently have come across nothing but total confusion amongst the electorate at parliamentary level as to why Faversham and Maidstone, or a large part of it, are yoked together. And any argument that there is a community identity between the two is optimistic, shall we say. So I say that it would be advantageous to have a more logical arrangement. And what we're seeing put forward is not a more logical arrangement. It's about the one thing you could, well, set of things you could do to make it even more illogical. So I actually do think that in principle we should be making a response about community identity and and that the principles put forward by Mr. O'Connell are actually the right principles, regardless of partisan advantage. We all know that the Boundary Commission doesn't really care about community identity at all, really, but we should. And we should actually try, as the representatives of our communities, to actually make an argument from first principles. I think we should. If we, obviously, other organisations not associated directly with the council will, of course, make their own independent representations, and I expect there'll be very, very many of those. But that doesn't relieve us, in my view, from our responsibility.
Could I be awkward and just press you? Just give me an opinion on what has actually been presented in the report in terms of the constituency layout that's been put together in a...
I think it makes a lot of sense. There is clearly Shepway, Parkwood and areas like that are part of Maidstone and not part of the borough of Swale. One can argue about precisely where a boundary between some of the Weald, shall we call it, and a Maidstone constituency would fall, but it is a logical division, if you call it that, whereas the status quo and the option put forward, talked about by the Boundary Commission, neither of those are logical in any shape, form, or existence. They're just mathematical constructs to get the right number of people in the right column.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Cook.
Thank you, Chairman. I think one of the first things that we need to note is, whilst obviously from an officer's perspective we will have a responsibility for the organisation of the parliamentary elections, and there are some logistical issues with that. But outside of that, what is being suggested from a boundary point of view for the parliamentary really doesn't affect us as a borough council. It doesn't affect the wards that we're in. There's a separate review that's going on that will affect that, and we will be busy working on that and making representation in that area as we agreed earlier. So I don't really, I think it's very much the representation that is going to come from Maidstone will come from the individual organisations that have a view that they wish to put forward. I think the right approach for us as an organisation and as a council that is essentially not affected by the parliamentary boundary review, it is one of neutrality, and we should therefore actually desist from making a representation. I take on board one thing in particular that Councillor Mr English mentioned, and that is the way that the Boundary Commission approaches this. And as I said earlier on another item, I've been through it. And yes, we do want to talk about communities and synergies within those communities. But ultimately, this comes down to one thing and one thing only, and it's the numbers. And that was very clear when we were looking. I mean, there are some tweaking at the edges, as it were, but broadly speaking, this is about numbers, and the Boundaries Commission job is to deliver a certain number of constituencies of essentially the same size. Now, when we were looking at this before, or when they were looking at it before, the idea then was to reduce the number of constituencies to 600. And that would have meant, actually, in Kent, we would have reduced by one constituency in Kent, which would have been Faversham and Mid-Kent. I don't know what the response of Maidstone Borough Council was when that suggestion was brought forward. Now things are slightly different, and we're actually looking at an increase of one in the county, and it particularly because of the nature of where that is, and partly because of the way that the community of Faversham and Mid-Kent, as the officer has already pointed out, we're sort of lumbered with that bit in the middle, because quite frankly, the biggest problem that we have is that we're surrounded by water on three sides. Yes. So I think on balance, Chairman, I do recognise, and clearly for the political parties that represented at Maidstone Borough Council, they may well wish to make representation, and I'm sure they will. But I don't think it's appropriate for us as a Borough Council, on behalf of our residents, to put forward our own ideas on this occasion, and I think neutrality is the way to go. So I will support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cook. Can I ask any other speakers at this juncture? Okay, so we have a motion from Councillor Cooper, seconded by Councillor Perry, which is to be neutral and not to make a response. Can I see all those in favour of that? And could I see all those against, please? And abstentions? I think, apologies, did I miss whether you voted? Oh, sorry, I missed that.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so that
Chairman, can I just come back on a comment you made earlier?
Of course, you'd be
I haven't
better
spoken
given
enough.
the nature of my
I
comment.
haven't spoken
yes.
enough this evening, clearly. I was just going to say, if elections, which are based on over 150 different pieces of legislation, some of them dating back hundreds of years, with another piece of legislation currently passing at the moment, introducing ID cards, are run for the staff, I'd hate to see what the alternative is. But I think I'd just say that a badly run election helps absolutely nobody.
No, I do appreciate that point. And
Chairman, it does come to mind, though. What
Okay.
we could do, just very briefly, is maybe what we should suggest is that they run parliamentary elections on a third basis.
Well, forgive me for pointing it out, but that is what happens in upper houses in places like Australia and the United States, obviously. Right, that motion is passed, which conveniently brings us to the end of the agenda. So I now declare this meeting closed.